First here is Patricia Raybon. She is a writer of faith by day and mystery by night. She is a Christie Award-winning Colorado author, essayist, and novelist who writes daring and exciting books and stories at the intersection of faith and race. And when we learned who this year's keynote speaker was, I remembered what her one book was about, and I thought, boy, she'd be a perfect fit for the program. Next to her is Randi Samuelson-Brown, who is a regular attendee at the Western Writers of America Conference. Happy to meet her up there and have her with us today. She is originally from Golden, Colorado, but now lives in Denver. She was a finalist for the 2021 Colorado Book Award for her book, The Bad Old Days of Colorado, and has won Equus Film Awards Best Western 2022 for her book, Brand Chaser, published by Wolfpack. And on the end, we have Marc Cameron, who is the New York Times best-selling author of the Jericho Quinn thriller series, which debuted in 2011. Since then, he's written 8 Quinn novels and 4 Arliss Cutter novels based in Alaska, including his most recent one called Cold Snap. He is an author of 6 Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan novels for the Tom Clancy estate, the most recent being Red Winter.
Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Shannon Miller, and welcome. And I wanted to start out by can we get a round of applause for all the authors? This is really awesome. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to see everybody in person again. Fantastic. All right. So we're going to start, and I'm going to start with Marc and then move back this way. Okay? So tell us a little bit about how you began writing.
Okay. Well, I started writing when I was about 8 years old. My aunt was a librarian, and I was telling somebody earlier that I really grew up surrounded by discarded books from libraries, and lived on a small ranch in Texas. But she had gone to a American Library Association convention and met a writer named Wilson Rawls. I don't know if anybody knows what Wilson Rawls wrote, but he wrote a book called Where the Red Fern Grows. And I was 8 years old. She brought it back to me. I have the signed copy by Wilson Rawls, and I read it. And I don't want to wreck it for anybody, but if you ever buy a book with a picture of a dog on the cover, it's going to be a sad book. And so I took that book to my 3rd grade teacher, and I said, "This is a really good book. Will you please read this to us?" And she did, and she cried her eyes out. And I remember that moment when I said, I want to do that. I want to have that power to make pretty girls cry. And so I've been writing and wrote about 20, from that time. So that was been in 1970, so about 25 years until I got my first paycheck, but writing the whole time.
Nice. Thank you.
I started writing when I was probably about 5 years old. I made this little book for whoever the president was at the time called Ruthie the Rhinoceros with pictures, and we mailed it to the White House. I think that is like the corniest thing. I don't think kids do that anymore, but that was one of my first that was the first book I wrote, and summers were kind of long in Golden, Colorado. It used to be a very small town, and so if I would take swim lessons in the morning, and I'd write during the afternoon. And my biggest, I wanted to be another Laura Ingalls Wilder, so I wrote covered wagon books, and it took me a long time to decide that I honestly wanted to write. As a writer, I was a history major, but come around 25, I started thinking about it again, and it's worked out pretty well. So thank you.
Thank you. Patricia?
Thank you. And I'll start by saying thank you. I love being places where there are people who write and people who read. And I also especially am grateful to be here in my home state in Colorado, because I feel I can tell you the truth about why I write. I started writing about 5 minutes after I turned 5 and could read. And that's because I grew up during the Jim Crow segregation era. I grew up under Jim Crow segregation in the 50s and 60s. And the message, of course, always was clear to a little girl who had learned to read when signs said whites only allowed. And that was true of a lot of libraries all over the country. That was certainly true of hotels and motels. There's a business called, I tell my age when I tell this story, called the Howard Johnson's ice cream place. Does anybody remember Howard Johnson's? And they would not let Negroes, that's what they said, come in and stay there. And when we would travel to the South, my dad we couldn't stay in a hotel or a motel. And so we'd have to get to a town before sundown, find the black part of town, ask around if somebody had rooms or to rent or a rooming house. Of course, now we call that Airbnb, but back then, the message was that this place where you live doesn't think much of you. But my parents believed the record of God. They were followers of Jesus, and so I would get these closed door messages during the week, and on Sunday, get the message that I was lovable and beloved of God. And that tension is where, from age 5 on, I've always found myself writing, because it's such a compelling intersection, this business of faith and race. And so the most recent thing I've written, I was saying to Marc and Randi, are mystery novels, and they also are at that intersection. So that's where how I landed in the space that we call writing. I didn't know any other way to reconcile or reflect on what life was like and what I was trying to figure out in my life. And so I turned to writing. And here we are all these decades later, still doing that. So thank you for having me today.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. So talk to all of us about your latest project, what you're doing.
Okay, so I actually am fortunate enough to be here with you all in Colorado today. I'm on a book tour for my newest Arliss Cutter novel. It's called Breakneck. I'm a retired Deputy United States Marshal. It's about we don't take a long leap from what we know, right? And this is about a Deputy Marshal based in Alaska. While we're on this book tour, my wife is driving. We started in Spokane. We flew from Anchorage, where we live, to Spokane. And then we've just been hitting towns all along the way for about 17 days. We're almost done, but fortunately you guys invited us to be here as well. And while we're on the tour, my wife drives, and I'm trying to finish up my last Jack Ryan novel while she drives, and in the evenings and mornings and whatnot. So it's, in fact, if I were in your shoes, I would be taking that pencil and that note card and be trying to work on a chapter right now. So.
Hello. I am working on 2 books. Whoops. Now I'm breaking things. I'm working on 2 books right now. One is the third in the Dark Range series. I'm writing about a female brand inspector from the state of Colorado. All my books right now are basically Colorado based, because this is where I'm from, and I'm passionately involved with trying to keep both the actual history alive and reflect what life is like here before it kind of changes a lot. So I'm kind of getting used to the passage of time. Anyhow, so she's a product of a heritage ranch, one of those ranches where people are kind of shady, but if things go really bad, we kind of lay differences aside and you kind of go get the shady people because they can usually shoot straight. So those are contemporary Westerns. It's been compared to C.J. Box, so that's good. good. And then the nonfiction one that is coming out is the history of the Western American horse. That'll come out by 2024, I believe. So I usually work on projects simultaneously, both nonfiction and then fiction. So I also do a lot of historical fiction, and I never write about like the really good people. I'm always writing about the quirky people. I tend to write about women. I tend to write about issues that bother me to this day. So you will see me bitching about McMansions. So thanks.
After writing for the Denver Post for many years, and also for the Rocky Mountain News. Does anybody remember the old Scripps Howard newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News? Oh, yeah. And I worked for the Rocky Mountain News for a long time. And then I went up to CU Boulder and taught in the School of Journalism. And I don't know if there are any buffs in the room. And then when my mother passed away in 2004, I decided to write for myself. And the next week I woke up and said, oh, that means to get paid, I have to do some work. And so I have written several nonfiction books in the faith area. During the pandemic, however, because I love the mystery genre and because I grew up in Colorado, I decided to write a history mystery set in Colorado in 1924 when the Klan ruled the state. And those of us here, in other parts of the country, when I talk to people, they're really surprised that Colorado has a Klan history, but everybody here knows that. And so my little protagonist is a theologian, because I love clergy mysteries. And she comes home to Colorado to solve the murder of her estranged father. She's also a Sherlock Holmes fan, but she doesn't know a thing about solving a mystery. But she knows if she doesn't try, that nobody else will care. And so that's what the first book is about. The second book, called Double the Lies, came out in February. And in this one, she's racing the clock to solve the murder of a young stunt pilot before she gets framed for the crime. So I never expected 4 years ago, if somebody said I'd be on a panel talking about the mystery series that I'm writing, I would have been surprised. But I love the genre, I love history, and I wanted to write a book that centered a young Black woman who's not the sidekick. I wanted to have her in the center of this story, fully developed and fully dimensional, and dare to believe that people would want to read it. And so I'm very grateful that it has been published and that I can share it with you here today.
Thank you. All right, so we're moving on because I've already gotten questions from you lovely folks out in the audience. I'll start again with Marc. Could you briefly describe the pros and cons of traditional publishing versus self-publishing? I'm not sure how much experience you all have with that.
So I attend a conference every year, or just started last year, but I'm going back again, a conference in Vegas called 20 Books to 50K, 20 Books Vegas. Really good conference. They put on and it's aimed mostly, exclusively to independent publishers or self-published authors. So, but they bring about 4 or 5 of us that are traditionally published to help talk craft and things like that. But I'm able to talk to a lot of independent published or self-published authors, and I've seen that it's changed a lot I got my first novel job at a Western Writers convention at a pitch session, pitching my book to an editor and several editors. But back then, there was a real argument over indie, whether they were real authors or not. That's not the case anymore. There are fantastic books out there that are indie. And the difference that I would say as a traditionally published author is you guys that are indie published have to do way more work than I do. You have to, I generally, it took me like 16 books before they let me title one of my own books. I generally have to do, I do quite a bit of the marketing because that's just the way everybody, it doesn't matter if you're Penguin Random House or Kensington or Wolfpack or whatever, you've got to do or independent. But designing the covers, I don't have to worry about that. So I would say that now, if I had, I'm going to pass this quickly, but if I had to give anybody any advice, I would say that the main difference that makes people unrighteously judgy about independence is there's no gatekeeper. And so what you need to do as an independent writer, find yourself a gatekeeper. Find yourself an editor that's going to look at that with, like, my wife is my first reader and is a retired 8th grade teacher, and knowing that that's how we make our money, she cuts me to pieces. So find someone that will bleed all over your work, make you kill your darlings, make you really, because that's what a New York editor does, and that's the main difference. You can solve that difference by finding your own gatekeeper.
I am traditionally published as well. So I'm going to echo what Marc says. There is also a new movement, though, coming called hybrid publishing. And so there's a publisher called She Writes Press, for example, and some of my friends are actually going with them who are traditionally published as well. And what I would say about that middle path of hybrid is sometimes you can write the book you absolutely want to write, but you can't quite get it published, but it's very good. What I do find with traditional publishers, they will a lot of times tell me kind of what to write. Okay, so Wolfpack will tell me I want a young female protagonist. I want it female adventure. It's going to take place in the West. No bodice rippers. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. No F-bombs. Go. So those are my parameters. But other friends don't have that. If they really have a one-off book that they want in their heart to write, maybe these hybrids are the way to go. Self-publishing, like Marc says, there are a lot of enormously talented self-published books, but a lot of times you can tell they're self-published because there's mistakes in the grammar. There's some little things are not quite right. So if you get a good gatekeeper, you're in with the chance too. I always say go to writers' conferences. If you don't go to writers' conferences, you are shooting yourself in the foot before you've even left the door, because these are where you're going to find the professionals. You're going to find other writers. You're going to find people who are interested in what you're working at. You probably have some bruises along the way that they will share with you to hopefully make your path a little bit easier than all of us have gone through. And I mean, I've had a very easy path, but at least I know how to avoid crazy people sometimes. So that is a thing, right? So keep writing what is in your heart. Just be advised. You have to be smart as to what the marketplace is I guess my bottom line. And it doesn't mean don't do something, but just keep your expectations and your positioning in the best place to get you what you ultimately want. It's about what do you want with your book, and then how do you get it. So, thanks.
Thank you.
There's nothing for me to add. I already shared with somebody earlier today, don't go it alone. That's what I always say. I love the collaboration that's available through just getting traditionally published. And if I were independently published or doing hybrid work, I would still find community around me to help me deal with all the parts of the business.
Thank you so much. All right, so I have a question about what is the best and worst part of the writing process for you?
The best part is that it's lonely, and the worst part is that it's lonely. I enjoy the research the most. I enjoy we were making a really good living with the Jericho Quinns. I retired I'm fortunate that I have a federal retirement from the U.S. Marshal Service, but I retired very young. So it's a small retirement, but I have benefits, which a lot of writers don't have, is health insurance, right? So I have my small pension and then writing, but we're making a decent living. But if I were to call the Pentagon and say, hey, I need to talk to somebody at NORAD about Operation Noble Eagle, I write the Jericho Quinn books, they'd say, oh, well, go through public affairs and we might get to you. But if I call somebody at the Pentagon and say, hey, I write the Jack Ryan books for the Tom Clancy estate, could I talk to somebody? They say, well, yeah, we'll give you the guy that wrote the SOP for Operation Noble Eagle and invite me to NORAD and, Cheyenne Mountain and let me ride on V-22s. And so the Tom Clancy, writing for the Clancy estate has opened doors that have made the writing process. So now when I write an Arliss Cutter or another Jericho Quinn, then they look me up online and they say, oh yeah, we'll let that guy in. So the research, that's my very favorite part. And not, as you might think, researching the V-22 or a good example of this was going to HMX-1, the Marine One, people that fly the white tops, pick up the president on the South Lawn and all that. Well, I went and I thought, I'm going to write about this HMX-1 pilot, this Marine Corps pilot, and that'll be a cool thing for a Clancy. I got there, and I met the guy that was one of the pilots. Coolly enough, the name was Matthew Quigley. His dad must have just really liked the Tom Selleck movie. But I met Major Matt Quigley, and he showed me around, and he said, you could write about us, but who you really should write about is that 24-year-old crew chief over there who's a young Marine who has this whole helicopter as his responsibility, and he's the guy that's saluting the president that's in all the pictures. Why don't you think about him a little bit? So finding those little unknowns, I go to, as a journalist, you know this, you have a list of questions you want to ask, right? But then when you get there, the gold are those unknowns, the thing that you had no idea you were even going to ask. That's the best part.
Being from Colorado, my family, some of them came right at the gold rush, some came in the 1880s. I take the 1880 group, but claim them. What I would say is my first book, which is a good book, still hasn't been published. It was a World War I book that took place in England, okay? My accent is wrong, in case you hadn't noticed, okay? So I made, the second book I wrote is called Market Street Madam. I know some of the descendants of Annie Ryan, who was the second-rate madam, and it's one of Denver's unsolved murders. What I started learning or figuring out for myself, maybe to an extent like Patricia here, I'm banking on Colorado. I'm from here. I sound like I'm from here. Brand inspectors will talk to me. BLM people will talk to me. All sorts of people will talk to me. And I kind of made a deal with the universe that if I ever got published, this Market Street Madam book, everybody's like, oh my God, but it did. And it did well. I promised I would support the libraries of the state. I promised I would support the small rural museums of the state. So anybody wants me to come talk, if I can do it, I will. And what I am finding is like all these wonderful people come up and tell me their stories, the unknown unknowns. And that, a lot of times when people tell me, it makes its way into my book. So while he's saying it's lonely, my life gets really crowded. I kind of want some of those people to go away. I want to be a little lonelier than I am because I'm like, you guys, I'm busy. I got to work during the day. It's like this whole thing. So, it's just kind of different how writing journeys change. But my favorite thing is I never anticipated how many cool people I would meet in the state and how many great stories I would hear. This is just totally a bluebird.
Nice.
I have two answers to that question. And the first is similar to what the panelists are saying here today. And that is the joy of discovering my audience. When I had the first book published, I talked to the digital sales director at Tyndale, and he said to me, we have authors here whose books who sell impressive amounts of books. And, in the Jerry Jenkins, Francine Rivers League. And then he said, the next category are authors who honor their hometown crowd. And he said, you wrote a Colorado mystery. And what you need to do is connect with those readers first. And then when that traction starts to develop, you'll see a ripple effect outside of the state. And so we were on a Zoom call, and I got off the Zoom, and I wrote an email to every library district in the Front Range and major library districts all over the state. I sent that same email to every independent bookstore and the chain bookstores. And over time, I could start to see the interest. And it didn't take too long. In fact, that same day, I started getting replies saying, that's interesting to me. I'm going to make sure, I'm going to look for that book. And then when I started going to book signings, I began to see the people who gravitate to my book. And I'll just tell this group what I say, but my readers are women who love Jesus and a good mystery. And I can't explain how I can identify my readers when they come into a bookstore, but I see them and I know them, and we connect. And it's a great honor to meet people who are enjoying your writing and your stories. But the other thing, very quickly, that I love about this journey is actually the revision part of the work. And in some cases in a craft world, some people would refer to that as rewriting. But when I think of revision, it's an opportunity to see again the story that's hidden in the effort. And that's when it gets really exciting to me. And so I'm grateful for the calling. I had parents who never said, you want to be a writer? That's impractical and crazy. They never said that. And so I'm grateful that I get to do this work every day.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, what is the story you've always wanted to write but haven't yet?
This is not fair. They always get to think while I'm thinking.
I know, right?
Well, I can't tell you that because you're all writers, right? I'm very fortunate that I get to write what I want to write generally. And with the Clancy's, for instance, people ask me, Tom Colgan is my editor, a fantastic editor with Putnam, which is the imprint of Penguin Random House. And people say, well, how much do they give you? Do you have like old Clancy manuscripts or, notes or whatever? And no, I remember one, I think 3 books ago, I was chatting, and we usually have a plot talk sometime in November, and then I start writing the book and then turn it in July. This one's due now. I think it was due last week, but he gave me 2 more weeks. But the prompt was, this is a Tom Clancy book with like 8 subplots and all of that running and different characters. The prompt was, hey, my parish priest is named Father Pat. Could we have him kidnapped in one of the books? And I said, yeah. And he goes, run with that. I said, that's not a Jack Ryan plot. That's not any plot, right? So I got to make up my own plot and, run it by him, run it by the estate and all that. So I think that's one of the beautiful things about writing. I have to write within a realm. I was telling Randi, I write, my father just passed away a couple of years ago, but he had glaucoma, so he's blind for the last 10 years of his life, which meant, and he loved reading my books, but which meant that my mother had to read everything out loud that I wrote to my father. And my mother is a sweet, church-going Southern woman. And so oftentimes I would be writing, and I don't generally curse. Coming from a law enforcement background, I got called out on it a lot, but I just never did, probably because of my mother and father. But in the books, I want my characters to sound real, right? So I would write along and think, Mom can't say that. I've got to do something else. And so, but I do. I'm very fortunate to write. Obviously, we all have dreams and goals, and I have a young adult story that I would like to write, but I've got contracts for 3 other books now, and so that's going to have to take a back seat. But I get to write about a deputy marshal based in Alaska who gets to track and all the stuff that I wish. I got to do that, but I was never nearly as cool as Arliss Cutter.
I'm in the fortunate position where I usually do have contracts going out into the future, so I'm kind of locked in as to what I'm doing. But honestly, what I want to do, and I've been thinking about it, and I am not copying Taylor Sheridan, I just have to say that. I want to do an origin story of the Lost Daughter Ranch, which is where the Dark Range takes place. I'm calling it Stampede, but it's a beautiful part of the state. It's really Kremling up in Grand County, and I would like to explain how some of these old legacy ranches came into being. I do, listening to Patricia here and the Jim Crow and all that, one thing that struck me is so dead bang on. We all want to identify with a book. We all want to identify with the characters. We want to look in the mirror and see somebody who we connect with. And so that is kind of the crew, for better or worse, that I often connect with. I tend to connect with the shady people, the prostitutes, the swindlers, the gamblers, the rustlers. And some older relatives of mine came into town, and we had dinner like at the Brown Palace Hotel. So this is like a big deal, this is like, Randi, we're being serious now. And we got all the way through the dinner, and I just remember these elderly pair of blue eyes looking at me, and they're like, we just want to know why. And I'm like, why what? And they're like, why the subject matter? Because once again, they're very nice people. They're religious, they're all this. And then I must have gotten dropped on my head as a kid or something. I don't know. So I'm taking the darker path, and I always do. Because I honestly think that in dire circumstances, sometimes the bad people rise to the occasion and sometimes the good people fall, and vice versa. So I think in historical content, we always actually need all of each other to get the right end product. And like I was talking to Marc, Colorado's always been wonky and weird. Right now I kind of lament stuff that's happening, but you know what? It's all happened before, I kid you not. Even, it's just bizarre. So anyhow, I want to do an origin story of the Lost Daughter Ranch. So I bet Mike Bray will let me. I just have to whine a lot.
Well, to answer this question, I think about tropes. And I have one in the back of my head that I'd like to try in a standalone that has to do with a marriage of convenience. And you know how that turns out already, right? Doesn't start well, but you know how it's going to end. And so for me, the fun part will be the journey of it. It's surprising to me because I don't read romance novels, and but I have a romance subplot in my mystery. And when I talk to people, they ask me, what's going to happen to Jack and Anna Lee? I had coffee recently with Sandra Dallas, who's the book editor at the Denver Post, and I'm sure many of you in here have read her books. And she asked me the same thing, what's going to happen to Jack and Anna Lee? And so because of that, and because I've enjoyed writing their story in the process of telling a mystery, I think I'd like to go ahead and try a standalone that leans into the romance genre with, of course, other complications. When I added that to my mystery, my husband said, that's going to be, my husband's sitting here in the front, and he said, it's a mystery. What's with this romance stuff? But the question applies to all of us. Because life is that mystery, but there's always that romance stuff, and so and it's always complicated. So I want to try that. So
Nice.
We'll see.
Nice. Thank you. Okay, so I have another general question, and Marc, I think this will be good for you to start with. Do you have any suggestions for how to bring action scenes to life?
Sure. Yeah, so when I write an action scene, I'm seeing it in my head. And take a fight scene, for instance. I look at fight scene the same way I look at dialogue. It's just dialogue between people with feet and fists and heads, right? And so, but it takes a long time. A fight scene in a Jericho Quinn book, or they really, or a Arliss Cutter book, well, any of the books that I write, there's a lot of fight scenes. They take a really long time to write a page and a half worth of a fight. You need to really break it down in order for it to seem real. In order for it to seem fast, you have to take your time writing it. So that would be the biggest bit of advice, I think. But I was telling somebody at a book signing a couple of nights ago, they were asking me a couple of questions kind of like this. They said, what do you do when you get to a chapter that just seems like it's slow? It seems like you don't want to write that. Because I plot mine all out, and then I go down and flesh out each scene. And if I get to a spot where I think, I'm going to skip this and write it later, I never write it later. If I'm going to skip it, I cut it. Because if I don't feel some compulsion to write, and action can be, pow, zap, zow, same bat time kind of action, or it can just be a compelling romance portion of the story. When I say romance, I'm with the little R, not the bodice ripper genre romance thing. But like Patricia said, life has sexual tension. It's got people at work you don't like. It's got maybe some action. All of us have some kind of action. Maybe it's a car wreck we were in or something like that. So I like to put, now, genre-wise, some books have more. Some books are going to be so action-related that you don't really have a lot of time for the romance. But you can have, I've contemplated in the book, I'm not doing it, somebody can steal this if they want. I've contemplated a marriage proposal during a mountain climbing thing. That's way cooler than getting down on your knee and, proposing to your really cool significant other. Do it while you're in the middle of an action scene. That's exciting. So I just try to make it, I take my time, even though it should be fast on the page, and try to, and really dissect it down and make it real. Make it, when I describe it, I've been in fights, and I can walk up to any one of you and say, have you ever been in a fight? And probably tell if you really have, because if you say, yeah, I was in this fight, it lasted half an hour, well, that's baloney. Fights last like 90 seconds at the most. And they're like a car wreck. You can't really describe them. So oftentimes I'll say that. It was like a car wreck. And people identify with that.
Action scenes, I can tell you what not to do. How about don't do what I do. What I do sometimes when I'm writing action scenes is I'm using a whole lot of long words, and I'm using good words, and they're descriptive, and they go on and on and on. Wrong pacing. So a lot of things about like action, it's all down to the pace. And so, if you're admiring a sunset, yeah, sure, get all romantic, whatever. But if somebody's going to like go ahead and hit you, it's probably like you're looking at 3 to 5 to 7 word sentences. And the words aren't very long words, because you need something that's very clear, concise, hits you and move on. In my books, I have some scenes like where riding horses aren't going terribly well, and and I'm talking like bad junior rodeo without the rodeo part, and it goes kind of fast, but when you fall off, usually you're just like sailing through the air, and next thing you know you're on the ground, and you're like, what happened, right? So I do slow it down. I do try to really watch pacing, and I tend towards like I want to show everybody I've got a good vocabulary. I want to paint word pictures. I would say action, violence, severe trauma is not the time to be doing that.
I would point out just one thing to dovetail onto what she said. Look at your point of view as well. Sometimes I'll write a fight that begins from an observer. So then that person can say, okay, and give the reader, okay, this is what's going on. And then do my 2-line break, and then it's from the point of view of the people that are actually in the fight. So that you can play with point of view as well.
I like all of these things so much. And I also like thinking about motivation, because two people can be having a fight, but the script of each person is really different. they're in the fight for a different reason. And I think informing the fight with an awareness of why the people are in conflict and even how they express that can elevate and sharpen what's happening in that particular part of the scene and enhance the action of it and the movement and the pace of it. So try to
Yeah, excellent. All right, so probably not going to, just so everybody's aware, I'm not going to get to all of your questions. So make sure you please do follow up
around.
with
We're
everybody.
around.
Yeah, follow up with everybody after. They're happy to answer questions. You've got a lot of really great stuff here. Okay, so how do you find your inspiration and what inspires you most?
Okay. What inspires me usually, and I was thinking about this driving down today, which is kind of really weird to do that. If somebody tells me something and it really, really bothers me or impresses me favorably, it can just be a throwaway comment. That tends to be what inspires me, because especially like if months go on and I still think of one thing, and that is actually what inspires me. Also, one of the big things that I'm noticing now that I'm getting a bit older is time is passing. So with the Colorado historical fiction books, I want to preserve some of these old stories that are going to be lost in time if people don't write them down. I want to tell stories that my grandparents and great-grandparents would be like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened. So that is one of my motivating factors. I am trying to preserve Colorado history, the good, the bad, the ugly, as to what, through my lens, what I believe to be true. And as time goes on, people are going to get different lenses. They're going to have different experiences. But for right now, I want to capture what I can do.
We'll go last. You can do it.
I'm inspired by the struggle that we have in the world, but certainly we've had in this country, to move beyond difference and to surprise ourselves, to discover that we can actually do that. And so I like wrestling with that in nonfiction formats and now also in fiction. I refuse to believe that there's not a way for people to get in the same space and meet, even if they don't think they have anything that they agree on. So, I like trying to see where that goes if I'll give some writing time to that.
So, travel inspires me, and me. You all have heard that I live in Anchorage, Alaska. You guys here are no strangers to cold weather, especially right this year. But so my wife and I travel now that we can a little bit, and I can write from anywhere in the world. We travel to the South Pacific. It sounds really snooty, the hoity-toity, like as we go to the Polynesian. But we have friends there that have a home, and they let us. We rent for very cheap from them in this little home with no air conditioning, but it's just paradise. We have a pool and all of that, and in the middle of it's between Tahiti and Fiji. Well, that's inspiring, but what really is inspiring, these are this is the island of Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, and that's populated by Maori people, Cook Island Maori, like New Zealand Maori. The Maori have a saying, and I can't remember the first half of the saying. In English, it's an older gentleman talking to a youth, and he says, "What is the most important thing in the world?" And the youth doesn't know, and so the old man says, "He tangata, he tangata, he tangata." And that simply means it's the people. It's the people. It's the people. And so really what inspires me is when I go out and I meet folks like this, and I talk to you guys, when I meet that young crew chief on HMX-1, when I'm chatting with people around the world who don't have maybe the same view we do, the point of view that we do here in the United States, and I really, unlike what I'm doing right now, just shut up and listen to them. That's very inspiring to me. To work with my youngest son my oldest is an Air Force physician. my youngest is a police officer, a SWAT police officer. And I just go, and I got a lot of stories to tell, right? But I don't. I just sit there and listen to these young men and women talk. And that's just way inspiring.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, since Mark went last, I'm going to just open it up. And if anybody feels like talking first, what is your writing routine? And do you have any writing tips?
Well, I'll just say that I try to write 2,000 words a day. I write 2 books a year. So my wife is pretty much back there behind me with a little whoosh. So I try to write every day. I have a book signing tonight at Tattered Cover. Is that what it's called? Tattered Cover. And I'll write tonight after that. And it's kind of a compulsion. But I'm fortunate that I can write full time. So I get up in the morning, brush my teeth, walk across the hall to my office. I don't open any emails. I don't do anything else. But I sit down. And if I could give you any tip, it goes along with writing action. When I finish writing in the day, I want my last sentence fragment to be this right here. So that when I start writing in the morning, it's that. And then I'm going, right? Then I can get going before I get the email from my agent or somebody or some guy saying, you're horrible because you're stealing money from the Clancy estate or whatever, crazy people. So that would be the tip I would give you is, and also one other tip, you can't fix a blank page. Don't be scared to write crud. Write some crud down, and then you can fix it the next day or after that, okay?
Thank you.
I guess one of my tips is don't believe your own propaganda. I have to tell myself that a lot of times. Sometimes I'll write things and I just think they're so beautiful and I'm just like, oh, that's just so great. And then you come back like next month and you're like, whoa, that is really, really bad. So what I would say is I try to write 1,000 words a day. I have a full-time job during the day still. And a writing tip, yeah, one of the best writing tips is try to avoid the word was where you can. There are a lot of better words, verbs meaning. And I write those verbs down because sometimes they just fly out of my mind. So I have a list of what I consider good substitutes for was. And I also search on the word with and that. So with, for me, tends to be a crutch, and that the editors usually take out, so that gave me a hint. Maybe I should be looking for those.
Nice.
I started trying to write 1,500 words a day when I switched to fiction. And because I'd heard a successful novelist say that that's his daily goal. And I can write 1,500 words a day, and it's not an unreasonable goal. But the measurement wasn't working for me. And what I decided is if I can write 2 good scenes a day, that's a good writing day. And so that's my measurement, and I feel myself getting good movement with that. And it also takes me to a place where the next day, the end of that second scene really propels me into the next one. And so I really am grateful for that measurement, and that's what I'm doing right now.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. How about, I love how the questions are kind of pacing through the writing process. We went from inspiration to writing. How do you organize your rewrites? How many do you do per book?
That's a good question.
Okay, so my
Interested to hear.
yeah. Now this is called showing your underwear. My first book, they said I would probably have 12 rewrites. I thought they were joking because I really thought I was much better than that, and I swear to God, I probably hit 17. So what I will say is, with time, you get stronger and you get with more practice. I read what I write out loud, which I hate, but I can hear where I stumble. I can hear contradictions. Somehow I can hear them much better than I can read them because it's almost like I'm too close to the page. But audio, I catch them. So,
When your dog whines, Ooh, that's bad,
Howls.
right?
My cat howls. No, no.
So I, generally speaking, I start writing longhand. I really like, anybody that follows me on social media know that I should probably be a spokesman for Blackwing 602 pencils. I just like writing with a fountain pen that my wife gave me years ago, or a Blackwing. Have you ever written with a Blackwing 602 pencil? I should own stock. Anyway, they're really, when we go to Rarotonga, I take about 200 of them and work them down to the nubs. But so I consider that my first draft. Now, it's really not the book. It's a bunch of legal pads that I've written ideas down, and then I collate that into scenes. And then those scenes that I've also written in pencil, I put in the computer. So that's arguably another draft. And then I flesh out those scenes. And then, for instance, the Clancy that I'm working on now, or the Breakneck that every book that I've done that took me 6 or 7 months to write, I write 90% of the book. So those 3 or 4, scene rehashes, whatever, I write about 90% of the book, basically to the penultimate exciting climax. So, in every book, generally there's you think the heroine or the hero are going to win, and then something horrible happens and they stumble again, and then the real climax happens in the book, right? I write to that point, and then I go back, because in a 120,000 word book, a character's changed a bit from the beginning to the end, and it doesn't really, they don't mesh anymore. And I don't go back and read everything every day that I just wrote. I just try to power through. And so when I get to that 90 percentile, I'll go back and I start again, and then I do my rewrites, and I'll slowly go through, and I use a double X. I'll go through in 2 capital X's, and so then I can do a universal search on Word and go to all my double X's and check, okay, this is something I need to flesh out. A really quick aside, on my very first Clancy, I wrote, I'm writing along, this is my first Clancy, I'm terrified, it's called Power and Empire. 8 different sets of editors had looked at that. I had written in my draft that I turned in, I didn't put a double X at that time, but I had brackets, and highlighted in yellow, it said, I said, what kind of planes does the Secret Service fly the Beast and their strap hanger? Strap hanger means the people that are not in the protective bubble, but they're like holding on because they're trying to keep up, right? So I said, and strap hanger vehicles. Ask Nick, and he's a Secret Service friend of mine. That made it through everyone. It was highlighted, it was bracketed, it was the editors at my wife, the editors at PR, Penguin Random House, the final reader who hasn't ever read it before, and then I get the final page proofs. The final page proofs that are the last chance you got. And I was flipping, I checked it all, didn't even see it then. It was just somehow the way it was on the page, it did not register with any of our eyes. And by the time it made a page proof, it didn't have highlights on it, but it did have the brackets. Ask Nick. And so I'm flipping through this cool scene of a presidential lift, and I about to hit send. This is good. And I go, so now I use a double X, and whenever I have a question, so I work all the way through, and then at the very end, then I get to that 90th percentile, then I'm on a roll. Then I know what Moncada is like. Then I know what Sabine, the evil temptress, is like, because I re-met her. So that's the way I do it.
Nice.
Oh, Patricia.
I can't follow up that story. That's a good
It was a good story.
I'm surprised as a new novelist, all the things that are hidden in the story that you don't see until you come back and do maybe round 3 or 4. And so I know that I need to look for those things, not only what's in the story, but what it's trying to tell me is there, what characters are trying to show me, who the villain actually really is. We're getting ready to edit book 3 of this mystery series, and after plot meetings with my editors and writing, and it turns out the villain isn't who any of us thought. And so, and we're excited that to learn who it really was. And now that we know that, now to go back and do another edit, now we can track that person's actions and thoughts and quotes and comments and dialogue throughout the rest of the book in a way that justifies, when you get to the end, who he really is. And so that's, for me, the fun part. Just cracking it until that real story comes out.
Nice.
I would add to that too, and this is something my agent says all the time. She says you might have to write 3 chapters before you get to the first sentence of your book. You can't be scared to do that. You've discovered that as you go. So don't be frightened to just write, and then you'll find the beginning sentence later on, or the villain, or whatever.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to do one really quick last question, and I know this is not fair to do quick last questions, but what advice would you give to an aspiring writer right now?
I met my wife in theater, and I had a theater professor who kind of took me under his wing, and he saw that I spent most of my time flirting with the girls and sort of hanging out to the side and not doing what I should be doing. And he had cast me in the play. I wasn't really studying my lines. And he took me off to the side, and very kindly he said, "Marc, he said, you're going places, but you will never amount to your full potential unless you learn to use those 15-minute segments of time that everybody else in the world wastes." And I've taken that so much to heart. I've written probably a third of the books that I wrote while I was still with the Marshal Service on airplanes when we were deadhead, didn't have prisoners, or sitting in I remember one of my partners with the Marshal Service I was making money already, so I'd bought him lunch, and he goes, "It must be nice that you got this side gig going on." I said, "Yeah, and I'm doing it right now while you're playing Angry Birds on your phone."
My word of advice would be get it on paper. It sounds like such a stupid thing to say, but I have talked to so many people going, I'm going to write this. And they're thinking and they're thinking and they're thinking. And they want to write. They want to write. But until you get the words on paper, none of us can help you. You can't help yourself either, because it's not on paper or on the computer screen. You have to give yourself something to work with. You have to give yourself something concrete to share with other people if you want their help. And until you get it on paper, it's just in your head. All best intentions are in your head. So get it on paper.
Well, in general, fear not. Fits for all of us. But because this business can be so competitive, and because some people do have massive success, and doors have opened, and that can be a big distraction. And so my working philosophy is actually from the book of Galatians, if it's okay for me to share with you that. It's just 1 verse 6-4. And it says, "Pay attention, Patricia, to your own work. And then you'll get the satisfaction of a job well done. And you won't have to worry about anybody else." And I printed that. That's the New Living Translation. I printed that out and put it above my monitor, because on any day, I could say, "Wow, look what happened to Randi. She's on the New York Times best-selling list. Look what happened to Marc. They're making a movie." And that can
It's hard. It is hard.
and that can take your 15 minutes and a lot more. And so if I pay attention to my own work, then my own work will pay me back.
That's so good.
That's
good.
great.
That is good. I needed to hear that.